Alright, everyone, welcome to You Have the Right to Remain Fat. I believe this is Chapter 7. Let's hope we can get through this and nothing goes wrong with the recording again, and maybe I won't scream my head off. The title of this chapter is Fat Phobia is the New Language of Classism and Racism. There is no shortage of examples when it comes to the ways that fat people create cultural anxiety. It is no accident that fat people are underrepresented in the workplace, academia, and mass media. When we are visible, we are portrayed as unintelligent, lacking in grace or complexity, inherently amusing, abject, and either sexually insatiable or lacking any sexual desire. Fat people are largely absent from meaningful portrayals of the future, similar to disabled people, trans people, and people of color. Once again, aligning themselves with actual marginalized groups. Ugh. Body size has some really compelling connections to cultural anxiety about class, race, and gender. Discussions of and feelings about class and race and gender have been transposed onto discussions of and feelings about fat people. I want to talk about the connections between fat phobia and class, race, and gender using the example of a campaign that was launched in January 2012 in Georgia. Children's Healthcare of Atlanta launched a scare tactic campaign targeting childhood obesity called Strong for Life. They purchased ad space on billboards and television. The ads featured stark images of unsmiling children in grayscale with bold red lettering that read "Warning" in all caps across their bellies. There was swift backlash against the campaign, but the verbiage splayed across these kids' bodies created a window into some of the less often articulated anxieties about fat people and the ways that obesity rhetoric becomes a stand-in for other cultural anxieties. These ads did the very thing to fat people that the culture does all the time. These children are dehumanized by the desire to use their bodies to tell a story about a culturally perceived problem. Their complexity is flattened and rendered invisible through the monochromatic story. Further, their unhappy expressions render them a cautionary tale. They are actually being warned against as if their fatness were contagious. This style of alarmist advertising subtly evokes the anxiety that fat is communicable through proximity to fat bodies. This illogical fear of infection is, in part, why fat people are socially ostracized. Okay, but it's not contagious in the way that, a virus is contagious, but to a degree, obesity is contagious. It's pretty rare for, fat parents to have thin kids because the parents teach those children poor eating habits, and therefore it kind of perpetuates this unhealthy cycle. Similarly, if kids are, playing together and one kid is eating junk food a lot, the other kid that may have parents that enforce more healthy eating rules may overindulge, and in that way they could gain weight. Granted, if the parents are pretty strict or monitor pretty heavily, it's less likely to happen, but to a degree it can be considered contagious, just not in the way that a virus is contagious. It's contagious in a slightly different way. It's kind of contagious the way drama is contagious, where it's more of a psychological factor that perpetuates it rather than a biological factor. That being said, I'm not saying that obesity itself is not a biological factor. I think you guys get what I mean, though. You guys get what I mean. What I found most interesting about these ads was the story that each of them told about class, race, and gender. I am absolutely positive that the person who came up with the copy of each of these had no intention of unveiling such a complex and nuanced set of cultural anxieties. Yet it is this inadvertence that makes it so powerful. The truth comes through if you know how to see it, and it bums me out to no end that it took years of studying nearly inscrutable high theory to be able to decipher the truth from a bunch of muddled indirect language. My God, so I'm getting some fat sapphic bro vibes from this. It took years of studying nearly inscrutable high theory. What does nearly inscrutable high theory even mean? What theory were you looking at? I understand what nearly inscrutable means, but, like, high theory to decipher a bunch of muddled and indirect language. One, it doesn't take years to decipher muddled or indirect language unless you're looking for something that isn't fucking there. Again, it kind of feels like they're putting themselves on, well, Virgie's putting herself on this academic superiority level over other people, saying that she has spent years studying inscrutable high theory. Like, one, inscrutable high theory of what? Of what? What theory? What high theory are you talking about? I was an English major. I know literary theory. I know a variety of literary theories, and to a degree, I understand deciphering things. And to a certain extent, actually, it's because I'm an English major that I understand. To a degree, you end up creating meaning that probably wasn't there to begin with, and you're creating it as you go. And it creates the thing about theory and imbuing it with media is that sometimes, like, for a highly structured narrative such as Breaking Bad had a lot of visual cues, had a lot of stuff just below the surface that kind of enhanced the overall storytelling. But then there's other things, like people looking for Christian metaphors in Harry Potter. Because there was that whole thing trying to make Harry Potter okay for the Christians, where it's like Harry, who was resurrected, represents Christ and his dying for the sins of others, or some shit like that. I remember reading something about that. And while you can theoretically say that it works, it doesn't always, like, it works for you. There was this kind of ghost story that I had to read in college, and it was a Victorian tale about this girl that was basically told she was crazy and sent to this mental care facility where they cut her hair. It went through this whole thing where it turns out her mother was in the same place and her father did the same thing to her as he had done to her mother. And it was this whole thing. And you can easily make a case of, this was a narrative of the lack of power that women had during this time and how easy it was to cultivate this, woman hysteria. And you can totally go into that, and I think it grafts onto the story quite well. But I had to go through a Freudian theory look at the story, and so rather than saying, she was just stripped of her power specifically came from her hair, because her hair was cut when she lost her power, therefore it was a metaphorical representation of her losing her power, and therefore her hair represented her penis. Like, that was, like, if you had a jump, if you just had a, wait, what the fuck? That was my class, because we spent 3 weeks on Freudian theory and everything came down to what was the metaphorical penis. So, that was, do you see how, yes, you can kind of get at something, but then it's like you take a hard left turn? That's kind of what Virgie's doing here. If it took you years of studying nearly inscrutable high theory to be able to decipher the truth from a bunch of muddled and indirect language, chances are you're projecting something on there that was never really meant to be there. There were 4 ads in total. I will describe and analyze 3 of them. The first image is of a fat, prepubescent boy around 10 years old. He is wearing a dark, tight, unbuttoned polo shirt and dark jeans. His hands are in his pockets and his shoulders pulled forward. Across his belly there is a line of text that reads, "Fat prevention begins at home," and the buffet line, which speaks indirectly to poor and working class people and to mothers specifically. You will not find a lot of upper middle class people at buffets because they defy the affluent and middle class value of restraint. The idea of restraint suggests that less is more, and that eating as much as you want is a sign of immorality and the lack of discipline that characterizes the underserving poor. Here's the thing about that. Yes, I do think that it's probably speaking more to lower income families, because for a variety of reasons. Lower income families, highly processed food tends to be cheaper. It just does, at least when you're looking at it. There's ways to eat healthy on a budget, there is, but if you don't have any like education to kind of help bridge that gap from a first glance, versus families where both parents are working 40 hours a week, everyone's exhausted, the processed food just looks cheaper and easier to grab. Let's face it, grabbing 3 boxes of mac and cheese is going to be cheaper than sometimes even getting like a head of broccoli, depending on where you are. There's ways to eat healthy within a budget, there is, but if you're exhausted and you're just like, I have kids to feed and kids can be picky eaters, it's easier to just grab the mac and cheese. I'm not demonizing the families for choosing this route, because I think there's the greater issue of just everyone being overworked in the US. And let's face it, food prices are fucking astronomical right now. But I think equating it with restraint and attaching morality to that, we're back to putting penises where they don't belong. That sounds so wrong. Oh my god, I didn't realize. That actually that sounded I was referring to the Freudian theory thing, but I didn't realize how that sounded until it came out of my mouth. Restraint is a concept poor people often can't afford to adopt because the maxim less is more is not literal. Restraint is only fun or laudable when the threat of actual loss or insufficiency is nowhere on the horizon. When you're broke, less is a very negative and often terrifying thing. Less is not a choice. It is a physical reality that has material and emotional consequences. So there is something to be said about, like, there have been discussions about minimalism being classist, and to a degree I agree with that. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say I grew up poor, although there were definitely times that we were poor. But one of the general things is you learn to hold on to everything because you don't know when you're going to need it. And there is this concept of why put more money out on something that you already have. You end up getting a variety of things, and so there isn't the less is more mentality for the poor. I do agree with that to a certain extent, because everything's about how much can you get for the least amount of money, because you are trying to make the dollar stretch. That being said, so I want to go back to her point about upper middle class people not eating at buffets because it goes against the maxim of less is more, and that it goes against restraint and is therefore immoral and all of that bullshit. I disagree with that. I think the reason why upper middle class people don't eat at buffets is because the food isn't that great. I mean, let's be honest. I've eaten at a couple of buffets. The food isn't terrible by any means. It's not like it's inedible. It's not like it's shitty food, but it's not nearly as good as food that you either make at home or from even just one of those mass chain restaurants. In my experience, the food just tends to be a lower quality. The clientele of buffets is largely comprised of working class and poor people who are successfully maximizing budgets by getting as much value as they can for the least money. Yes, to an extent, I do agree with this. The economic decision is intuitive, and in fact, it is the concept of restraint that is contrived. Again, I think I think she's right with the working class and poor will go to buffets to maximize the amount of food that they can get within a budget, although buffets can also be expensive. But then I think by inverting that and saying that when you have more money, you try to restrain and would like pay the same amount of money for far less food, I think that there's a missing variable there of the quality of the food. And I don't think that necessarily the concept of restraint is contrived. I think that there is an issue, at least in the US, given that we're a highly capitalist culture, there's an issue of overconsumption in general, not just of food, but of a variety of things. We're a highly consumable culture, and because of that, a lot of the things that we get tend to be cheaper, but they don't last as long. So there's this that's like fast fashion industry. There's this whole issue with, it's less about restraint and more about, if you have the money to get something high quality that's going to last you longer, then yes, you would get the high quality thing that lasts you longer. It's less about having more, but when you're poor, you kind of have to get the cheaper things in higher frequency, and therefore it looks like you're consuming more, even though things break down more. I think this is more, I think that she's missing some variables here in her argument. By calling out the buffet line, the creators of the ad are perpetuating class-based bigotry while also creating deniability by not explicitly naming poor or working class people. I disagree. I think that one of the things, buffets, so it's not like poor and working class families can go to the buffet all the time. It's often, I would think it was seen more as a treat, because buffets aren't exactly cheap, although perhaps there are some buffets that are cheaper. But I think part of the issue with buffets is that it encourages this kind of gorge yourself until you can't move kind of mentality. And what the ad is talking about is, don't let that become like a regular eating philosophy for your kids. The buffet line is, I mean, if we're going to get into an analysis of this, the buffet line is representative of overconsumption, because there's this sense of like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And so it evokes that imagery, and by putting it across a child's stomach, it's saying that, don't let your kid overindulge. Not so much, stop going to the buffet, you poor whore. Like, I don't... If you're the family that goes to the buffet even once a week, maybe try to teach your kids not to eat themselves to the point of, like, it's Thanksgiving dinner. Further, this ad is speaking specifically, though not explicitly, to women, because we know statistically that women are still the disproportionate meal preparers and providers. Some of this disproportionate parenting comes from the reality that women earn less money, and for a straight couple, it makes more economic sense for the lower earning parent to stay at home. Perhaps this is because feeding children is still perceived as female-gendered labor, as it is part of caretaking. Regardless of the reason for this disproportionate parenting, the ad again avoids an overt reference to mothers, but because of the reality of sexism, they are clearly the intended audience. There are plenty of single fathers, though, that would take their kids to buffets. Like, I don't know. I'm not getting that sense that it's calling out mothers specifically. I think that it probably would apply to mothers more often, but I don't think that means that the ad was directed towards mothers. If anything, I would hope that by including the buffet line in the ad, it might also call fathers to take a closer look at what their kids are eating and maybe potentially getting more involved. There's a couple of different ways to read that ad, and I think saying that it's demonizing both poor working class people and mothers is a reach. The buffet reference speaks to working class women without actually saying, "Dear poor women, stop feeding your children," in a way that feels intuitive to you. Your parenting is toxic to your children. That's a lot to get from the ad that you described. They're not saying stop feeding your children in a way that feels intuitive to you, which is a stupid line to begin with, but it's saying don't let your children overindulge regularly. I also don't think it's saying that your parenting is toxic. I think it's saying this is something that you should look at. There's such a thing as constructive criticism even in parenting, even though I know that that's such a touchy subject to correct a parent. This is a kind of soft way of doing so. If you're the parent that parents with food, then perhaps you do need to reanalyze how you parent, renegotiate how you parent. The second ad depicts a fat prepubescent white girl, also around 10. She has long, light brown hair and is wearing a long-sleeved striped t-shirt with jeans. Her frowning expression stands in marked contrast to the way white girls are usually portrayed in popular media. Her arms are crossed over her chest, her shoulders hunched slightly. The phrase, "It's hard to be a little girl if you're not," is splayed across her belly, telling a story about gender anxiety, inadvertently questioning whether a fat girl is even a girl at all. No, I think so. I think it was poor phrasing, but I think it's hard to be a little girl if you're not, meaning that she's a big girl because she's fat. It's not, I gotta admit, I don't really care for the phrasing there. That feels kind of shitty. But I don't think that it's questioning the identity. I think the operative word that they're looking at there is little, not girl. The gender anxiety at the root of this idea is very familiar to me because I grew up feeling like I was straddling masculinity and femininity. I grew up being told I was a girl, and yet because of my size, the behavior I experienced from my peers felt more in line with masculinity. At home, I would watch movies that showed me that girls get treated like dainty, delicate flowers and boys get treated roughly. At school, I was treated like a big, tough boy, not like a flower. I don't think that's exclusive to you, Virgie. I don't think that's even exclusive to like fat girls. I think that's a fairly generalized thing. I don't know of many girls that were treated as like delicate flowers in school. I think there was like one that was just like teacher pet all around. Everyone liked them. But anyway, so, for example, during playtime with the other girls, we would often enact scenes from the Babysitter's Club or other books and shows we loved. When it came time to play out the romantic parts, I always played the boy without question. We never even discussed it because it was just silently understood that boys are bigger than girls and I was bigger than everyone else, and therefore I was the obvious choice to play the boy. Or none of the other girls wanted to play the boy, and it was just easier to kind of pawn it off on you. Like, I never had reenactment of romantic parts from anything as a kid, but me and a couple of other girls that I knew would play Sailor Moon. And there was a girl, being kind of like the bossy boots kid that I was, always insisted on playing Usagi myself because I had the longest hair. The second longest hair always had to play Venus, and then there was this girl with this short bob that I always made play Mercury. It was, for me, it made logical sense, and I wasn't doing it to put the other girls down. For me, this is like the way it had to be because of hair length for some reason. And eventually they stopped playing with me because of that. Looking back on it, totally justified. Because I was being, bossy boots rude. Like, it was just the way things were. And to a certain extent, if you got tired of always being cast as the boy because you were probably the one that would stick up for yourself the least, then if you had just stopped playing with them, it would have happened to someone else and you wouldn't have had to play the boy anymore. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, like, it's easy to say that as an adult. It's much harder to do that as a child. So, like, no shade on her for that. I don't think that this was, I mean, part of it could have been your weight. I'm not going to say that it wasn't, but part of it probably was your weight. The other part of it, though, could just be that maybe you were the least liked in the friend group. Maybe they had this kind of strict rule. Maybe you had another facet to your personality that they felt more matched a masculine role. Maybe it was kind of a covert bully situation. Like, just there's a couple of different ways that this could be interpreted when you really take a good hard look at it in hindsight. I don't have enough details about the situation to give any like serious look at this, and it's her memory and it's how she felt at the time. I don't think that it was necessarily that bigger girls always have to play boys. I remember for the entirety of 4th grade, every day at lunch, my best friend Lorna and I would reenact the romances between BSC's Mary Ann Spire and Logan Bruno. They were the only long-standing couple in the book series, and everyone I knew desperately wanted to be Mary Ann. I desperately wanted to be Mary Ann, not just because I was a supremely horny and suppressed Christian, but also because I wanted evidence that I was desirable. Okay, so when I was talking about Sailor Moon, I was talking about, like, fucking 2nd grade. I'm guessing this is older. Which, I wouldn't have thought that kids were still reenacting scenes and stuff when they're older, but, I was homeschooled at that point, so I don't fucking know. Lorna was a nerdy Chinese girl who wore glasses, and I was a nerdy Mexican girl who wore glasses. Our most significant difference was that I was big and she was small. I wanted to be Marianne so badly that I never once even suggested that we switch roles. I was too afraid for the unspoken truth to be out in the open. I felt the looming rejection, and I was scared of what would happen if we actually said the words. So I played the boy every day. I would pick her up. I would make her feel small and beautiful. I would put on a southern twang just like Logan had. I would suck up my desire and my most vulnerable wishes so the story could be believable. This just seems, the more I read this, the weirder it seems. Am I wrong? Like, there's something off about this. I feel like there's missing information here. So when I saw the ad for the first time, it hit me. It resonated. It is hard to be a little girl if you're not. Fatness disrupts the cultural obsession with sexual differentiation, the gender binary, and idea that women need to be clearly and visibly distinguishable from men. Fat women have bigger bodies and often more strength because of those bigger bodies. Fat men may have bigger chests and softer bodies. The cultural treatment of fat men's bodies centers heavily on sexist rhetoric. Fat men are often cast as feminine. I've noted that many instances of fat phobia directed at men, though certainly not all, are about the anxiety that fat men will be perceived as woman-like. So I believe that it is the deep cultural hatred of feminine that leads to some of the instances of fat phobia that men experience. I like how, she's one of the few people that actually references, stigma about weight in regards to men, but I like how she still kind of curtails it into it being against women. And I say I like that sarcastically. I don't know. I'm not saying I don't see anything of what she says. I see what she says a little bit. For me, it seems more often that the fat men are cast as bullies. We have Harold from Hey Arnold. We have every fat person in a David Cage video game. I don't know, when I think of fat male characters, I don't think of them often being portrayed as feminine unless they're also gay, and then I think it's more about equating gay men with an effeminate nature rather than fat men being portrayed as effeminate. Because the one effeminate larger male that comes to mind would be Cam from Modern Family. But I honestly think that's more about him being gay and having a more theatrical personality than about him being fat. While researching this phenomenon for an article, I noticed 3 themes pointing to sexist anxiety about fat men's bodies. First, there was an anxiety about chemical feminization, the concern that fatness increases the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. In a Salon article entitled Sex Researchers, Size Does Matter, subtitle, Study Shows That Fatter Men Last Longer in Bed, Should Americans Rejoice, Judy Mandelbaum writes, men with excessive fat show higher levels of the female estradiol sex hormone. This substance apparently disrupted their body's natural male neurotransmitter chemicals and slowed their progression towards orgasm. Ironically, the less masculine their bodies appeared, the better lovers they proved to be. No other possible conclusions or analyses of this finding are discussed. Second, there was anxiety about fatness obstructing the visibility of men's genitals. A popular meme was what I started calling the fat castration meme. The idea that fat men cannot find their penis or are otherwise figuratively castrated by their fat. Finally, I found anxiety expressed toward fat men developing breasts. In a Men's Health article on banishing your man boobs, the author writes, you probably love a great set of breasts as long as you're not the one sporting them. The language draws parallels between compulsory heterosexuality, masculinity, and body size in one fell swoop, subtly policing the boundaries of sexuality by pointing out that only women should have breasts and that men should be attracted to them. If you have man boobs, then you are blurring the culturally sanctioned bifurcation between men and women. Further, since fatness is rendered as an individual choice in popular cultural discourse, it is taboo for a man to opt into a more feminine gender presentation since femininity is debased through misogyny. So when I see the Strong for Life ad, I see some of the same projection of anxiety about gender onto this girl's body. I also see the role of white femininity in the construction of gender and the way that the chubby white girl in the ad creates tension between ideal femininity and fat embodiment. There's just so many claims here. I don't even know how to, in an organized manner, go through all of these. I mean, everyone has, there's often common body insecurities among people that have ears that stick out further tend to be self-conscious of it, and many will even get like just an ear pinning surgery to help pin it closer to their head. People with gaps in their teeth often have insecurities because of that. Not all, but not all men that have like moves are self-conscious about it. I don't know. I don't think that there's anything necessarily wrong with the men's health article, and I think it's perfectly reasonable that many men would want to get rid of their man boobs. The tone of the verbiage shifts in the third ad, which depicts a fat black girl. She is maybe 11 or 12 and looks like she has just begun puberty. She is wearing a white baby tee and jeans. Her black hair is shoulder length and pulled back in a white headband. Her hands are in her pockets, her shoulders hunched forward a little, her lips are pursed, positioning her femininity as different from the white girl's. The message becomes more personal in her ad, and the scope of the message smaller. Fat may be funny to you, but it's killing me. The only ad of the three that makes reference to the individual unit, the self. The subtle shift in language from passive voice to second person felt significant, but I didn't quite have the language to articulate why. I asked my friend Sirius Bonner, a diversity and equity consultant, fat woman, and black feminist who lives in Portland, Oregon, to share her thoughts on this image. She told me fat black women have a very particular spot in the public consciousness. They are considered inherently humorous. The use of the word funny is an othering reference to the inherent humor that black women are considered to possess. The shift from passive voice to second person takes the conversation out of the realm of the universal, reminding the viewer of the black-white binary. She points out that white bodies can be discussed as stand-ins for all people, but black bodies are not allowed the same versatility in our culture. So I had a different interpretation of the line, fat may be funny to you, but it's killing me. Given that the black girl was probably around 11 or 12, puts her right in middle school age where she's likely to be made fun of for being fat, and that where the kids laugh at her. So in that way, fat may be funny to you, but what they don't see is that it's killing her in more ways than one. It's killing her socially, it's killing her physically because she's overweight. So rather than making fun of her, I think it's calling to help her get to a healthier weight. But that's my perspective. I look back at the image after talking to Sirius and saw that the girl's fatness had become a vehicle to leverage a critique against black people. The verbiage rendered the treatment of her fat body as something that implicated her community. Through the you reference, the viewer is called to participate in the racist act of blaming and pathologizing black people in the name of public health. Wait, what? Through the you reference, fat may be funny to you, but it's killing me. Okay. The viewer is called to participate in the racist act of blaming and pathologizing black people in the name of public health. But it seemed like fat may be funny to you, but it's killing me. The funny to you seemed a bit to shame the person that thought it was funny. Am I completely misinterpreting this? Or does this require a level of fucking mental gymnastics to get where Virgie's coming from? The idea behind the ad is that being fat is a life-threatening affliction and that fat people should be avoided because we are vectors of disease and death. Right now, our culture equates fatness with mortality and ill health. But in order to understand the issue from a social justice perspective, we must widen the frame and allow complexity to enter our field of vision. When I look at the literature on the subject, I find glaring holes in the deduction process. There is compelling evidence that racism kills people. There is compelling evidence that living with the stress of poverty leads to a number of mental health challenges. There is compelling evidence that weight-based discrimination leads to heightened levels of stress and anxiety that suppress the function of major organs. And there is evidence that fat phobia leads to shortened life expectancy. But racism, poverty, and weight-based bigotry are all social problems. It is through victim-blaming narratives that we cast these social issues as individual ones that can be solved through bootstrapping and consumerism. Unfortunately, these solutions are only survival mechanisms at best. As we undertake them, we only dig ourselves further into the very oppression that we are attempting to escape. I think that she misinterpreted. I say misinterpreted, but the truth is that if you're looking at something through like a literary analysis, you can kind of interpret it however you want, because one phrase can be used to endorse a couple of different viewpoints based on the light that you cast on it. That's just the way analysis works when it comes to reading analysis into words. And she certainly, here's the thing, she actually put together a decent literary argument. Her analysis was not great. She projected a lot onto certain words without explaining how she got there. And she used her personal narrative. While that is a reasonable form of literary analysis, is to project your own personal experiences onto the text. That is a form of literary analysis that's done. It also tends to be a lower form of literary analysis, at least from my experience. And it's very specific to you. There's nothing wrong with reading things in your own personal lens rather than taking a different lens to kind of analyze it in a different way. There's nothing wrong with looking at it through your own personal lens based on your own personal history. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But you have to acknowledge that your interpretation is going to be heavily colored. And that while you can make this argument and it can provide some interesting conversation pieces, it's not fact. It's not the way that it was meant to be portrayed, and it's probably not even the best analysis available. And yet, Virgie puts this, and this again kind of comes back to her over-focus on perpetuating this victim cycle in relation to herself more than anything else. More than just being a fat woman, specifically to Virgie, she kind of paints things specifically as a way of victimizing herself, and we saw this with how she ties her personal narratives back to the ads. I think she went a little far with it, but that's me. I'm curious to know your thoughts on it. Let me know in the comments down below. We have 4 more chapters to go, and then we'll be done with this. I'm starting to think that we probably won't get into the second book. Kind of after all I've seen of Virgie and how much it's become more apparent that there's things she's not dealing with, and it's coming out as these outrageous claims of fat phobia, and she seems to be hyperfixated on her sense of victimization through fat phobia and fat oppression, or whatever the fuck they say. But whatever the fuck the fat acceptance people call it, fat phobia, fat oppression, whatever, however Virgie wants to refer to that. And it seems as this is kind of a distraction for her to ignore unresolved trauma within herself. So I want to finish this book because there's still plenty of bullshit to cover. I don't know if I'll go into the next book because it's kind of become apparent to me that Virgie has unresolved trauma, and this whole fat acceptance thing that she goes like with her whole chest on seems to be a way to distract herself from dealing with other issues. But that's the video for today. Some quick updates. My weight kind of bounced around this week. I ended up weighing myself 3 times this week. Once on Tuesday, Wednesday, where I was down to 181 and I was super excited about it. Weighed myself last night, was back up to 188, weighed myself this morning, back down to 184. So I have no idea where my weight actually is at the moment. 181 is the lowest the scale has read for me in over a year. So I'd like to say that I'm down to 181. That would be lovely. But I'm going to take the 184 average, meaning I've maintained and we'll see where my weight is next week. When it comes to other things, I finished my draft for my capstone, and so far, because I've had to show my capstone in piece drafts to my professor, and so far she's been okay with everything. I sent the last piece of the draft to her for review, so we'll see what she says about that, but otherwise I'm done with my draft. There's definitely some tweaks to be had in my paper, but like, I'm nearly done. I'm super fucking excited about it. I also got an interview for a teacher position, which I think I mentioned in the Wednesday video, but I'm super psyched about that. I've also been reading a shit ton of manga and have been looking at different anime streaming sites and considering signing up for like High Dive or Funimation, because I'm a filthy dub watcher because I like to crochet and craft while I watch anime, and it's just easier to do it with English dubs. I'm not going to say that English dubs are better. I don't think that they're better. I think oftentimes the Japanese audio, the Japanese voice actors are better. There are some exceptions. There are some good dubs out there. I think Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood was done very well. I think Death Note was done pretty well. I'm currently rewatching Wallflower, which I haven't watched in, 15 years. And it's kind of bad, but the Wallflower anime is also, like, I forgot how fucking random it was and how outlandish it was. It's enjoyable, but I forgot how that was. So, quick things I want to note manga-wise. I started reading Noragami, and Noragami manga is even better than the anime. The anime started out kind of slow because there was this over-focus on Yukine at the beginning that we didn't really get to know Yato and Hiyori as much. But with the manga, it feels like we get a little bit, things are expanded on, scenes are expanded on in a way that it kind of draws you into the universe a little bit better, and we get a general better feel of the characters. I also found out that my library has recently stocked a bunch of BL manga, so that's what I've been reading. Current favorites are Deko Boko, which had 2 volumes, Sugar Days and Bittersweet Days. That one was a really cute story between 2 childhood friends. It was a well-done narrative. I liked it. Sherry, My Destiny was a one-shot manga. It wasn't bad. It's very tropey. And it's just kind of a surface-level story, but it was cute enough. The Cat Proposed, I highly recommend. Oh my god, it's a Bakeneko human romance, and it's such a sweet story. And it actually got me to look into Kodan, which is a Japanese form of storytelling, and I'm actually adding that. I have this huge list of hobbies, of things that I want to try in my lifetime, and I really would like to find out more about Kodan right now. I also watched this thing from a bonsai museum, and now I want to get into bonsai, but that's going off topic a little bit. I recently started up Ancient Magus Bride again. It's been like 10 years since I read that, maybe less. No, it's been more like 5 years. Sorry, it's been more like 5 years since I read it, but when I read it before, it only had like 6 volumes out, and now there's like 17, 18, so I'm super psyched and reading that. Finally, Manga Owl had been taken down, finally found a replacement for that, so I can read the Water God's Bride. So I'm just reading a shit ton. Like, I completely took off the barrier of how many series I wanted to read at one time, and I've just been fucking going nuts. I think because I finished my draft, and now I'm like, there's still a few weeks left before the school year starts up again, and I need to start teaching again. So I have just been diving headfirst into narratives left and right. Super, super excited, and I love them. One last recommendation. This is an all ages recommendation. It is a wonderful, wholesome story. It is so sweet, and it's called A Man and His Cat, and it is the fucking cutest. I highly recommend. I cannot recommend it enough if you like sweet, wholesome stories. It's adorable, and I love it. So yeah, I've just been rambling on. This is something that, with my next project starting next year, I'll end up starting another YouTube page after this with content focusing on reviews, like episode reviews of series that I love with crafts to go along with it, reviews of hobbies, reviews of anime and manga, that whole thing. That's what, and it's all going to be fairly short form. I'm aiming for 5 to 10 minutes, 15 for some of the others that have things to go deeper into. That's like my next project, looking to the future. But anyway, I've rambled on long enough. Let me know what you thought about this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.